Are you an adventurer looking to take your hunt to the next level? Then you're in the right place. Welcome to East Meets West Hunt with your host, Beau Martonik.
Yeah, so when you're saying the early morning to the the midday switch, are you saying that he's probably a little bit lower for the early morning one and then shifting up higher, or the
he may be on the same elevation.
Okay,
what
but
here is he may be in one drainage, and he's wanting to get to this drainage over here, this thermal hub, and so I'm going to anticipate that he's in this one, and I'm going to get to where he's going to want to be. He may be on the same elevation. He just may be, because that's what I tend to see, is they kind of bounce around these different drainages, and they'll stay higher in elevation. They'll be in this one this morning, and then midday he may switch over to another one, and then he'll bed in that for his midday bed. And then once he exits that, that's when he's using the thermal hub itself in the afternoon. So I'm trying to kind of anticipate that. Okay, I'm in my early morning bed. I fed. I got in my bed, right after daybreak, and then when he's switching, I'm trying to anticipate what thermal hub he's going to be in and try to be in that bed, waiting for him, basically.
yeah, and I know Paul talks about that a lot too, is like getting set up on those places, like anticipating those shifts and when they're going to move, being on like, it's kind of the outskirts of where they might be bedding at, and just like, and he'll hunt all day early season on just like anticipating some of those switches. After we got off our podcast, he was like, help me break down this area that I've known. This buck's like 9 years old that's living in there. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure this is where he's living. He's like, and I showed him where I found a shed and all this stuff. And he's like, yeah, that makes total sense. And he's like, if I was you, this is where I would get in and set up and sit there all day. He goes, he's probably shifting around in some of these places, and, to be able to have that opportunity.
Yeah. Cause the thing here is, the thing that I always ran into when in this mountain hill country and kind of rough, rugged creek bottom, is the way the deer bed, the way the mature bucks bed. It's not the same as ag based. It's just not. You can't predict where he's going to bed at as well. It's not as easy to get in there, because you're usually, the thing that I've always had issues with. When I tried to hunt where I thought they're bedding in that early morning, is I always busted them out of that bed because they were already there before I, made my approach. And if you got there 2 or 3 hours beforehand, the thermals are not in your favor. He's walking right into your thermals. So you're not going to see him at all then. So it was just better to try to get into an area that they want to get to after they bedded that initial time, because that initial time is just so random, and it's such a knife edge that you're trying to predict and trying to get into, that it just didn't really make sense to try to do that. So I'm trying to predict that second movement, and it's usually in those, like I said, those V-shaped drainages. Then that's when the V-shaped drainages really are what you're wanting to key in on, instead of those U-shaped, big flat bottom drainages and thermal hubs. You're going to those V-shaped at that point in time, getting that steepest terrain that he can possibly seek out, basically.
Do you find that in and around these thermal hubs that the bucks will use the same beds a lot, or do you find that they will shift a lot more, like just different beds, but within that necessary drainage?
I think as they get older, I think they start getting to where it's 1 or 2 or 3 beds, like that. Their bedding really shrinks down. But here, older classes start doing that. You're usually talking 7, 8, 9 year. The older bucks, because bucks here can get really old. There's not a lot of hunting pressure, but what I see is in that 4.5 to 6.5 year old range. They're not as specific. He may bed on this side of this little micro drainage one day, and he may be on the opposite side the next day. And he may bounce around. But he's going to be in that general area. But he's just probably going to be using a different bed. And then once as they age up, I feel like they get more. They get more bed specific to where they maybe have 3 or 4 beds only.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And like, I guess when I look back at like a buck that my dad killed in 2021, that deer was 8.5 years old or so. And what he learned was that that deer's home range was so small. I mean, even during the rut, like it almost seemed like the does came to him versus like
Yeah.
even when they're in that 4 to 6 year old range where they're, moving around a little bit. Cause I've always had such a trouble finding a specific bed that I felt confident in versus a bedding area, type of deal.
Yeah. When you're hunting big woods, trying to find one specific bed that buck is using is it's worse than finding a needle in a haystack. I mean, it really is. A lot of times you just can't tell. It can look like a bed, but it might not be a bed. Like it's just one of
Yeah.
those odd situations in this type of terrain and territory that sometimes you just don't know. I never have enough confidence that I say, oh, this is a bed that he's going to be in 3 days this week. Like I just never have been able to be confident enough in that because I've never had enough success trying to do it. So I just try to get myself in an area, that I think, well, this is probably the area. And then if and a lot of times this is the biggest thing that I have issues with myself is I'm confident in an area enough to hunt it one day, and then once it doesn't produce, damn, I'm moving on. Like I didn't produce when I thought it was, and this is something that the cameras have taught me is play the long game, because a lot of times if you're confident enough to hunt it at one time, you need to be confident enough to hunt it 4 days in a row.
Yeah.
Because that's really what it takes. If you're confident enough to say, I'm going to hunt this one day, you need to be willing to put 4 days into that location.
I totally agree with that. And I've told this before on the podcast, but like when I was younger, I'd find these good spots and I would just sit there for a week straight and I was always killing deer. And then once I started taking in too much knowledge from other people, which was maybe prevalent for their types of areas with higher deer densities and everything, but they were talking about really being mobile and moving all the time and doing this. And I started doing that and I wasn't finding the success. And I was like, when I wasn't overthinking it and I was just hunting the spots that I knew were good, it worked out. And in these areas in the big woods and stuff, there's low deer density. I mean, and also the deer can sometimes be moving 60 yards away from you and you just can't see them. And I've come to learn that the patience aspect of like, and it becomes harder too when you scout so many places, you just have so many places in your mind to like, okay, I have a week to hunt. Like where should I be at? And a lot of times you gotta trust your gut or trust you trust the sign of what it was showing you. And that's very much harder to do than it is to say, but
it really is, because it, like you said, there's always something greener. There's always something better on the next side of the ridge, and that's what I'm trying to get my mindset back into is, and I'm just like you. When I was younger, that's what I used to do, and I killed a lot of good bucks doing that. And it was mainly because I wasn't scouting that much. I had a favorite spot or two, and I really wanted the time to scout all over the other place. So there wasn't anything else catching my eye that drew me over there. So I had my good spots, and that's where I would hunt. And that's really how you have to hunt because you got to get out of the mindset that if you're hunting in big woods, low deer density, you got to get out of the mindset that you went in there so you blew everything out. Because if you went in there and didn't see anything, there wasn't nothing there. I mean, that big buck didn't come through if you're there and you didn't see him. If you're confident in your spot, you didn't blow him out. He just didn't come through that day. Well, that's not a reason not to go back. That's a reason to go back. And you got to look at it that way instead of the opposite. Instead of it discouraging you, you got to say, well, I know he's coming through here in 4 days. I've got to sit there enough till he's eventually going to come through this area. Because that's just how the deer work in the big woods. Is you take 1,000 acres, they're going to use 300 of it. You put yourself in one of those 300 acres at some point in time, you've got a really good chance, but you've got to be patient enough to stick with it till he comes back around,
Yeah. And then that all comes down to like when you're hunting an area over and over again, it just comes down to being really, thoughtful on your access and how you're doing it and getting into there. And that's what's become, I feel like, in the last 5 years for me, something that I've really put a lot more focus on. It's like, okay, you know how to find the spots, you walk enough, you can find good spots. It's like, how do you make sure that when you're hunting them over and over again, that you're being the most efficient and you're not decreasing your odds the more that you're hunting it?
Yeah. That's really it. Is that it's finding the spot, having the confidence in it, to put multiple sits into it, and having the confidence of how you're accessing it is not ruining your hunt, is not blowing everything out beforehand. And a lot of times, it's like, and that's why I like these hubs, is because I know that my access is easy. Like I'm accessing them in an area that deer are not going to be in, and I'm accessing them at a time and place that deer are not going to be there. Like I don't have to worry about, if I blow a doe out, more than likely it's going to be in an area, if she smells me, that's not going to affect the buck that's in that hub. So that's why they're kind of almost, I wouldn't say they're bomb proof, but if you hunt them correctly and you put enough days into one of them and you have enough information that gives you the confidence to sit there, it's one of the places that you can go and hunt and know that if you put the time in, you're not going to do as much damage. It's not like walking his entrance trail that he may be walking as well, or be crossing at the time. You're not worried about that.
Do you find like them bedding with any particular terrain features or cover or visuals? Like, is there anything? Because obviously, like when you look at like some of these thermal hubs, you have these points of the ridges that are coming out. Do you find it where they traditionally are bedding out on those points, or do you think they're bedding more with cover? If there's cover out there, that's great. Or like that they might be back in towards the draws a little bit, that might be choked with some more, mountain laurel or thicker stuff. Like what do you find in kind of a trend with that?
Honestly, not really very much of a trend. They do like those secondary points. If they can get on those to bed on, and by secondary point, I'm not talking about a huge ridge that has another secondary point. It may just be if you go up into one of these V-shaped ranges and it splits off, there's normally a ridge that it's a small ridge. It just may look like a round area, and they'll usually bed right up on the end of that. Like that's a preferred area. Now, if it has nothing, if it's bald, it has nothing, just trees, they're going to find somewhere that they can hide that's going to be adjacent to it. Blowdowns are really good. Like if you can get an old blowdown tree, stump, or something like that, they'll find that. They'll bed near that because they can use that as back cover or even front cover, But yeah, as far as terrain goes, when you split those micro ranges, usually you'll have that little rise, and they'll usually bed right there, And what I've actually anecdotally by my own anecdotal work is what I've noticed is when I work into these areas, like if I'm going during season to go check trail cameras, I find myself walking up these drainages the same way. And the last couple of years when I've been walking up them, I've always seems like I'm bumping a mature buck, or not even mature bucks, but bucks in general that are just like, they're not bedding in those drainages, those V-shaped drainages midday, but they're just staging in them, like they're just hanging out feeding in them. So I'm constantly finding them in that area, and that just seems to be something that they may not have an area that they're particularly bedding in, but that just seems like a focal point that they're just kind of hanging around in. So they may be bedding nearby, dropping down into those V-shaped drainages because they're steep, and they usually have red oaks, white oaks. They're usually around here chock full of soft mass and stuff like that. So it's easy access for food,
Yeah. And too, like, I feel like with bedding, it's like more times than not, I'm not looking at these big ridges that are coming out as I kind of used to, as far as with them bedding out along the edge of it, that you always hear traditionally that's where they're going to bed at. Now they might, but I feel like cover has more of a play to it in the areas that I've hunted than the wind does. Like, for example, there's a place that I know of, that this beautiful point that comes out would look like there's a nice drop off, great visual. It's perfect for them. but it's wide open. But on the other side, which is actually the south side of that, and which way the historical predominant wind direction is actually coming from the southwest, so it'd be almost the windward side, but it has some mountain laurel, but it's kind of like where it's scattered mountain laurel a little bit. And I found this little knob, so I actually found it. And I know you did a post about this, like with using Spartan Forge and the other mapping applications to look at using the excuse me, I'm losing my train of thought here, but the slope angle, and finding the little knobs that are kind of in those places, little high spots that are within something else. Sometimes that is all that it takes for a buck to feel comfortable, because they're not reading the rule books that we put out there or we talk about. They're just trying to find those places that give that sort of advantage. And for me, it was like, okay, they want cover, they want smell, and they want sight. Now they can't always have all three of them, but they always like to have at least two, it seems like. And so it depends on how that all lays out. But I look for those micro things, and that's why I love slope angle, because like I've read topography my entire life. My dad was always huge on reading maps and going through and looking at it, but I find these now slope angle just makes it quicker. It just pops out. You see red all around, and then you see a yellow or a spot that doesn't have any color shading to it, and it's just a small little dip. It's like, all right, there's a flat spot that's within all of this steeper terrain.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, any of those, they're, like you said, they're not looking for the does will bed, and the younger bucks will bed on those bigger knobs and secondary ridge points and stuff like that. And especially during the rut, you start looking at you find those, and then you're looking for the areas that the buck would bed nearby. And that's what that's the main thing is then look, let's say you've got a ridge point, got two secondary ridges, and they look really promising, but there's nothing really around them that's cover based or anything like that. Then you're looking down. I'm looking for the downwind closest area that has like you're saying, something smaller with steep terrain. So if once I see that red or that orange that's really steep terrain, then I'm looking for a area in that area, nearby that offers something, a terrain change with that steep terrain close by. So that's how you use how I use the secondary points, especially during the rut, is to think, well, that's where the does are probably going to be bedded at. What's the closest steep terrain to that would offer him cover and an escape, position, basically.
Yeah. And before I have a couple other questions based around wind and food, but the one thing I want to know if you consider this what would be a thermal hub. So I don't see these a lot in Pennsylvania, but when I was hunting in West Virginia, there's a lot of them, and it was a concentration of bucks in these particular areas. And I learned it from a local guy, Josh Ilderton, is a friend of mine, that where basically you get like these U shapes, but there's not like ridges that pop out. It's just literally like kind of flat walls that come out, and then the bottom there'll be like a flat bench that a lot of times are kind of open, but it still kind of has a thermal pull that comes down to it. And it just seems like those areas, sometimes they might be grassy and brushy and everything in there, but it seems like that is a hub for those bucks to be at.
Yeah, and then sometimes the hubs and stuff like that. You're talking about on the mountain itself, like a bench.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and we see them here. And a lot of times, what affects that in the area that I am is in the ridges we don't see a lot of benches and stuff like that in this area. But what we'll find is rocky outcroppings. Like you'll be walking up the side of a ridge, or up a secondary point, or up a main ridge itself, and you'll come to like a rocky outcropping, and the trees are blown down. It may kind of level off a little bit, just a little less steeper terrain, but it's got steep terrain, surrounding it. So it's just like a bubble around it. And those are focal points too here. Like I drop a lot of cameras in those, and man, they seem to be. They're usually down here. They're filled with sparkleberry. It'll have blown down trees and stuff like that. Man, if you can, that's another Really good point. And the wind flows differently in those areas. You get more of a when you get the higher tree terrain around you, you kind of got that band that's like doesn't have very many trees. What you get is a Venturi effect, where that wind speeds up right in that area. And so it's almost like a little safe haven. That's the way I look at it. It's like a safe zone for them to kind of stage and hang out,
Yeah, because I've struggled to hunt right in those places. So like I'm still in the process of trying to figure it out, but like getting just off them or trying to figure out how they're coming into these places to be able to actually hunt it.
Yeah.
And it also seems like does will bed right on those flats.
They will. They'll bed right on those flats. I've got a one of my weather stations positioned in one. It's a really prominent one. Like everything around it is nothing but Virginia pine trees and loblolly. So it's really enclosed. And right in the middle of it is this rocky outcropping where you got a bunch of sparkleberry. The canopy drops probably 30 or 40 feet, and it's just a band that goes around the side of this ridge. And I got several cameras, and I got a weather station right there. And you'd be amazed at the different wind directions as opposed to my other cameras or my other weather stations just for that one location. It is so much different, And those are the things you're really trying to find, is just those really anomalous things within the canopy, within the terrain that draw deer,
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And the other question I had was around wind speed. So like I know like you're focusing off of thermals in these hubs, but is there does it get to a point where there's too much wind in general that kind of throws it off and it's not worth hunting at those days?
Once you get those high wind velocities, I would say it depends on the thermal hub itself, of course.
Yeah.
If you get this deeper, got higher elevation on each side, and it's like that, it's not going to be affected as much. But the shallower one, let's say you've got only 100 feet, 150 feet of elevation change from the bottom to the top, the main ridge point. Usually once you get about a 7 or 8 mile an hour wind, anything above that, it just seems to balance that movement out, or balance the wind movement, the thermal hub movement. It'll start pushing the wind to that or pushing the thermal up the opposing ridge side. So if you've got a north wind, it kind of pushes that thermal up that south, the north facing slope of the opposite side. And then you'll start seeing, that's where I was saying, like, a lot of people fall in love with hunting downwind of a scrape instead of hunting down thermal of a scrape. The thing that I see that really tells me that downwind is not exactly the best is even when that changes, I don't see movement start kicking off in that downwind portion. So if the wind is overriding the thermal, the buck is not going downwind to that scrape or that thermal hub. He's not using that. It doesn't change his movement. He's only using that thermal hub when the thermal is in effect. And if the thermal is overridden, he's out of that ball game. He's not using that.
Yeah. Do you think that they'd still bed in those types of areas or like live within that hub during those higher wind speed days? Or are they go into areas that you feel like are better for those particular situations?
They go better. I think they seek out a different alternative, because their advantage for that is gone at that point in time.
Yeah.
Once that wind speed goes, then they only got a visual advantage, and they may not have cover because a lot of these thermal hubs, if you look at them, they're kind of open. So he's really going to be relying on his visual advantage at that point in time, and he's just, I feel like they're seeking out a different alternative at that point. So high wind, once you get in that 10 mile an hour, 7, 8, 9, 10 mile an hour range and above, I'm not hunting a thermal hub at that point in time at all.
Okay. And what about food? Like, how does food affect it as far as food sources and crop and everything? Like, as far as if there's, say, whether there's acorns on top of the ridge, but there's nothing down lower, are they still going to drop into that hub? Do they still use it similar?
Yeah, I don't see food source in the hubs changing at all because it's such a quick movement. They're not coming down there for food. So they're not really,
Gotcha.
they're not really, like the one that I have, the one I posted on there is mostly, it's a hardwood pine mix, but there's not any food in that area. I mean, it's woody, there's forbs and stuff like that. Like, that's another thing there, I don't see a lot of them using the ones that do have food. Like, if you have a big one that has white oaks in it, like, let's say it's a thermal hub that is mostly hardwood and mostly mass producing hardwoods, or white oak, red oak, those, they're not going to use those. They'll use them, but it'll be at night. They'll use those after, because there is absolutely no cover at all. So the ones that I'm seeing the most benefit from, as far as a hunting perspective, is it's got to have some sort of low layer canopy cover
Yeah.
within it. It's just it's just an added layer of protection for them. So the one that I'm dealing with there, I'm doing a more in-depth video on it that I'll put out too, that kind of shows how it looks, and it's very, it's filled with vines. It's got a maybe chest deep high of just browse basically within that thermal hub, and just with little pockets of open areas in it. And those are ones you really want to look at. If you find one that's maybe just completely open, doesn't have any cover, any ground cover at all, more than likely that's going to be a nighttime only use. That's what I've just kind of figured out.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I just I tend to go, like, it was honestly just because this is what I had available to me. Was most of the areas I hunt don't have any mass producing trees, and it's all browse that I've kind of hunted, and it seems like historically the patterns, you have more patterns year after year because they're browse based versus mass, which changes everything. I just get more frustrated when I'm hunting massed areas because it can change, completely different year to year when you're focusing all on that mass. And it's like, I again, I've told this a bunch of times on here, but I had this area I thought was super remote, great terrain type area, but it was all open hardwoods, and it didn't have the food to even produce big deer because they relied just on that mast. And if there wasn't mast, you'd have these old deer that had, big pop cam bases on them, but stubby little antlers, and just they didn't have the food necessary to be able to go through it.
I don't really hunt, based off of food here, because there's a white oak on every ridge, and they all produce about the same, like, we don't have feed trees or anything that really draws them. They can walk anywhere here and basically either get browse, forbs, and when the white oaks are producing, they're everywhere, unless we have a bad, here, the best hunting is when we have when we've had a terrible white oak crop, because that does limit everything to just the browse at that point in time. So you can eliminate that, but they limit the mature bucks eliminate that themselves. So if you're after a mature buck, hunting in the open hardwood white oak flats and ridge tops is just you're only pissing in the wind,
Yeah, that makes sense. How much do you put, talking about other kind of like terrain features there, the opposite to the thermal hubs? What about like topo hubs? Do you pay much attention to those?
I do. Yeah. The higher elevation.
Yeah. So basically, for anyone listening, like where you have a bunch of ridges that meet at one point, almost like the spokes of a wheel.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. If you go back and look at some of my stuff I first talked about with the guys from the Southern Outdoorsman, we went into great detail about those too, and those I use. I do that. Those can be a little, like, they're not as, I guess, I wouldn't say they're less predictable, but I guess they're more subject to wind at that point in time. Like, you're going to have to play the wind direction angle a lot more in those, whereas you don't really have to do that in the lower elevations. So yeah, but yeah, I do pay a lot of attention to that. And a lot of my early camera work that I done trail camera wise was based off of how they interacted with the higher elevation scrapes and stuff like that. So
yeah, that's because I don't know, well, at least a lot of the areas I hunt in Pennsylvania don't have a lot of the big knife ridges. Some of them do, but like where that creates these actual funnels with these topo hubs that are there. But down in West Virginia, it was like that was like a game changer during the rut, especially.
yeah,
It was like these bucks are, I found a big scrape under this bush where there's cover around, and there was two ridges that kind of met one main ridge right there, and put a camera there, and it was like. And it's funny, I had said on video, I was like, oh, if I sit here 4 days during the rut, I'm sure I could have a chance at something nice. What do you know? I don't go there. And 3 out of the 4 days that I was hunting down there, it was like a mature buck coming through, cruising through those particular areas. Now, I'd seen some in early October coming through that, but not nearly as much as, during the rut specifically.
Yeah. There are a lot of this around here. It is rut based, the higher elevation, but I do see a lot of usage in that early. Like if you're going to do if you're hunting early season here, or in this kind of mountainous terrain, like kind of what I'm in, that I focus a lot of my morning hunts on that higher elevation, and I'm trying, and I'm not really seeking the highest elevation. I'm more seeking that mid-level, the second level. So if I've got a ridge point that's say 1,500 feet in elevation, and the secondary ridges drop off of it, say at like 1,300. Well, that's where I'm going to be focusing on, and I'm going to be focusing on them dropping from that higher elevation down to that secondary area before and positioning themselves for that movement to the lower elevation once the thermals drop. So that's definitely one of my and I've done a lot of camera work. That's where a lot of my cameras are put into as well. So
okay. Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's great for intel too, like just because it's really good for camera intel of like knowing there's a buck worth hunting in the area, then to start spider webbing those cameras out. Because like I know for me, when I go into a new area, I don't typically start with plastering it with cameras until I know it's worth something hunting. So like that's just like one of my key spots that I know that I put a camera here, I'm probably throughout the season gonna get a good enough buck on there that okay, this is warranting me taking another 15 cameras in and starting to put them in these other locations.
Oh yeah, and that's kind of the way I do it too. I'll pick like a big hub system like that. That's what I call them, hub ridges, and I'll just pepper them out, at first if I'm coming into a new area, and I like to get at the head of those drainages, where those drainages come up and kind of feather out to the secondary ridge points. That seems to be the point where they kind of when they're traveling up those things, they'll kind of feather out and then they'll J hook onto those secondary ridges, and that's the way I try to hunt them. Generally, is I try to pick one that's that where he's going to be J hooking down that secondary ridge point. Early in the morning. That's what I try to. That's kind of my hunting strategy. A lot of it for morning hunts is to try to work up a drainage to a point, and then set myself up to where either he's coming off of that bed that he got into early morning and working up into the higher elevation in the midday, or I'm meeting him there coming out of that drainage. And that's how I've killed several nice bucks by doing that.
It's funny, as you're talking about that, you described the situation. I have my map pulled up on my other screen here, and there's a spot I had found when I was spring scouting down in West Virginia where it's on top of the hill, the very top, you have the Topo hub where I had my camera before, but I guess it's about 250 feet down over, you hit the first somewhat bench system where down there's not a lot of benches, but a secondary ridge comes out that was old strip stuff. So it's a lot of bushes, a lot of thick cover, a lot of briars. And then it goes to the open hardwoods and the oaks. And right at that ditch, at that line there's this steep drainage that comes up. And then there was a scrape right there. And just like, it was just like the ultimate hub of of travel and movement. I'm eventually going to put out a YouTube video showing, I kind of went through the whole area and explaining it, but I kind of had like 2 trees picked out, one that was kind of below the trail and one that was above. And my biggest thing was like trying to figure out how to access this particular spot, because I don't have access from the bottom because it's private where you can't get in from. So like I was like almost like I'd have to come up over the other one and drop down on top of it to be able to get in there. But basically I'm thinking like they're either, depending on how the crop is, maybe they're feeding out, out on these ridges, are going to come back to bed in some of that thicker stuff, or maybe they're actually out in some of the grasses and coming back and moving around that line. But I'm trying to figure it out like early season, how it could work out.
Yeah. And here what we see is a lot, or what I see a lot of, is that movement up into that higher elevation is right at daybreak. They're staging out in the lower elevations and stuff like that. So you can, if you're trying to come here from the bottom, you better pick the right bottom,
Yeah.
or you're going to be walking right up with them, So it's a lot of times what you're talking about is actually probably a better idea, is to come in from the opposite side and come up if you can. Even though it may be way out of your way, you risk less chance of actually walking in with a deer you're trying to hunt. That's the issue with coming in from the bottom on a lot of these hubs that are just, it may be just one mountain range or one ridge that contains 7 or 8 different secondary ridge points, and your only access is from the bottom. A lot of times you got to figure out, or just kind of take a guess, I guess, on where that buck that you're hunting in the area might be from, and try to come in from the opposite side, or you'll be walking in with him,
Yeah, that's the hardest thing of like trying to understand that. And and I think it's like messing it up a few times before you kind of figure it out.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I won last year. Actually, it's year before last, I did the same thing. I had him down, had him patterned. He's about 156, 160 inch 11 point. And I mean, that morning I had him on camera working this one secondary ridge point like 4 or 5 days in a row. And I'm like, I know he's not going to be on that one today. He's worked that ridge point for 4 or 5 days in a row. I said, I'm just going to take a guess that he's going to move over a little bit based on the wind adjusting a little bit. He's going to be on this next one. So I start working up like an hour and a half before, 2 hours before daylight up this drainage. And it wasn't very far. I only had to go like 400 yards from where I parked at, basically up to the ridge point. And sure enough, I get right to where the head of that drainage drops off. And I've got my green light on, and I look up 5 feet in front of me, and he's standing right next to me. Like just standing right on the side, like on the other side of a brush pile from me. He's just standing there looking at me like, yeah, buddy, we're doing the same thing, Yeah. And he pointed out, and I actually almost had a shot at him about a week later, and he just would not offer the right shot for me. But I'm still after that buck. But yeah, that taught me a lesson, that's when I really realized, he's doing the same thing I'm doing, so that's something you really got to think when you're trying to access from the bottom up in the mornings. That's, because they are using those drainages to get up and down. And if you're trying to do that too, you're good chance you're going to be walking in right there with them,
Yeah, no, I just feel like sometimes with these things, you can have the best laid plans, and it takes kind of screwing it up, or it works out and you made the right choice. But like it's to really figure it out, because there comes a point where it's really, really hard to predict, and it's like, all right, sometimes you just got to take a chance.
Yeah, and because I mean, you look at a ridge system like that that's got multiple secondary ridge points, and a couple of bucks are using them. I mean, even a lot of these, they set up that they could use any of those ridge points or any of those drainages under multiple wind directions. Like he can use this entire side of this mountain with a north wind, to access. So there's so many options that you're really it's just taking a chance at that point in time that you're not going to bump into him, and a lot of times you're going to at some point in time. You just gotta bite the bullet,
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. But it's, Yeah, it's like looking at hunting these types of hub systems and some of this different terrain outside of the rut has really opened my eyes to other opportunities. Whereas, like, again, you'd asked me, 5-10 years ago, it's like, oh, what about early season in the big woods? I was like, just kind of write that off. It was just you're wasting your time, so to speak, and I don't really feel that way now. It just takes a lot. It takes a lot of scouting and a lot of thinking about it and understanding how terrain and thermals and wind and all that kind of stuff flows to have those opportunities.
Yeah, it's just unlocking all those puzzle pieces and putting them together. But yeah, it can definitely be done. I mean, I've hunted this big timber my whole life, and it's totally different from hunting ag or hunting areas where you have a lot of diversity, but it's still the same thing. You're still trying to find that diversity within the terrain, and that's what really separates, how the mature deer, if you're after a mature deer, travel versus, just any other deer. If you're just out hunting deer, then sure, it's different. But when you're trying to unlock how that mature buck is definitely using the big terrain, it's not, you got to think way differently,
Yeah, and when you're hunting mature deer, you're typically probably not going to see a whole lot of other deer. So it's like, again, it's the mind game of am I doing, what am I doing that's right, or am I completely wrong? Because they travel differently, they hunt differently. I always think if I'm seeing a lot of deer, outside of the rut, it's like I'm probably not in the spot where I'm going to have a chance to shoot a mature deer.
Yeah, it's like I told a buddy of mine, we were talking about the area he hunts. He asked me back during turkey season, we ran into him, and he's like, how many deer did you see this year? Were you hunting? And I said, well, I only saw 22. I hunted all year, Yeah. He's like, you saw 22 deer? I was like, yeah, that's it, 22. I was like, I've got them counted down, And he's like, oh my God, I can't even, I would be so defeated if I only saw 22 deer. He's like, I saw 22 in one weekend,
Yeah.
Like, it's way different here. I said, it is not, you've got to have a whole different mindset when you're looking at 8 to 10 deer, 7 to 10 deer per square mile, as opposed to 30 or 35 in a lot of areas. It's you got to have almost a defeatist mindset of going in, of saying that I'm probably not going to see a buck, or see a deer today, And when you do, it's like, oh my God, I actually saw one, So
yeah.
But yeah, another thing I have, if you're hunting in the big woods, if you're hunting and you're comfortable, you need to move. If you're comfortable where you're sitting at, and you got good, everything looks pretty, and you say, "Oh, this is a really pretty spot," you need to get down from that tree right then.
Totally agree. There's so many places I'm like, man, this would be a great spot to sit in a tree. It's beautiful, like overlooking this, big oak ridge, and I got the valley over here. It's like, yeah, it's not a good spot though. It's normally my spots I can't see more than 15 yards sometimes, and it's just like kind of nasty and not the prettiest type area to sit in.
Those pretty oak flats that just draw you in so easy. It's just so easy to just go and throw a sit at them. But when you look at it, it's like, it's like one of my favorite places to hunt here. I might could shoot a deer if he come in 15 yards. Like, he's got to be within 15 yards of me, or I couldn't tell you if there's anything, like it is so thick. I got some buddies, they're just like, I don't know how you hunt that. Like, I would never go do that. Like, you're I couldn't spend a day sitting in the middle of that, and I'm like, well, that's the difference between us. I can justify it, because I know what's coming through there, but, I don't kill as many deer as they do either,
Yeah, that's it's like there's a spot that I've hunted where it's a hemlock covered side hill, and it just pulls downward thermals all day. It pulls down. It's great, but when I'm sitting in the spot there, literally the most I could see is 15, maybe 20 yards, and it's just like underneath some of that like hemlock canopy or any sort of conifer, it's quieter typically. You know, the ground's a little softer, and they walk in. You can't even really hear them coming in a lot of times. So it's a really, you know, you got to be alert, because all of a sudden there's the buck that you were hunting, and he's standing there at 15 yards, and you had no idea that he was coming in. And that is very tough. Like last year I went up to Alberta during November, and I went to hunt with an outfitter up there and do some product testing. And the guy said to me, he's like, "No, just understand the deer density isn't very high here. You're probably not going to see many deer." And I just laughed, and I was like, I saw 4 times as many deer as I'd see the whole season in Pennsylvania. And I was like, this is not low deer density. So
it's amazing when you move, if you've hunted it and hunted in a really low deer density, when you go into areas where it's like, oh, you know, it's the bunch of deer, it's just a whole different, you know, they don't act the same. It's just it's a completely different deer, you know.
Yeah.
And so, you know, here the deer, you'd almost think they're overpressured, you know, because of just the way they act, but they're not really. It's just there's just so few of them that they just don't behave the same. You know, it's almost a whole different class of animal in a way, you know. So you got to almost hunt it that way, you know. So
yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And like I said, I just think it's so awesome that you know, you're in Alabama, I'm in Pennsylvania, and the more I talk to the guys all over, there's so many of us that are hunting these big woods, you know, hill country, mountainous type areas, you know, all different regions, and there's so many similar trends. Like, you know, the food might be a little bit different, and the cover might look a little different, or different plants and trees, but it's all relatively the same when you think about it. And it's pretty neat. There's a lot more of us out there that are dealing with some of these struggles and having to hunt this way than I originally thought.
Yeah, and, you know, you get so when you hunt it like that, when you're used to hunting that type of style, you get so you know, your mindset is nobody else can experience to what nobody else. You know, it's like you don't realize that you're not alone. You know, like
no.
You know, and when you start talking to other guys, it's like, wow, you know, everybody, I'm not the only one that's having to deal with this, you know, this issue at all, because it is, you know, when you do hunt the big woods and you hunt the low deer density areas like that, it's like I said, you almost got to have a defeatist, not a defeatist mindset. You got to have your confidence in yourself that you can get it done, but you got to realize that you know, I'm not gonna go out every day and see a deer, and you got to be okay with that. You know, if you can be okay with that, you got 1 foot ahead of everybody else. It's the ones that can never accept that I can go out a day and hunt, or go out 3 days. I mean, I hunted 11 days straight last year at the prime time of our season, during the bulk of our rut, and saw a total of 1 deer during 11 days. You know, like that's tough. You know, like that really beats your ego down. You know, and I have all this information. You know, like I've done all this trail camera, and you almost feel like, well, I'm just a crappy hunter. You know, like and go out for 11 straight days and see 1 deer. You know, but then that 12th day, you know, I didn't close the deal on a deer. I think I missed the deer, but you know, all it takes is that 1 day. You know, like, and then your confidence is back. You know, so it's really just a continuation of building your confidence up, and just knowing that eventually, you know, I'm going to have that chance. I got to capitalize on it, you know?
Yeah, that's the same way it was for me last year. It was like four days of not seeing a single deer, and I hadn't seen a single buck in 2 weeks, really. Like, I mean, I was hunting pretty dang close to every day, and then all of a sudden, last light there, that I shot my buck, and all of a sudden it was done, and I was like, oh, this is great. You know, it went from the lowest of lows to the highest of highs in a split second.
Yeah, that's the way it is. The big woods hunting is like that. It's a lot of grind it out until you can't, you know, and that's when it's usually, you know, it's always seems for me, it's always that when I'm least expecting it, that's when it happens, you know.
Yeah, and it always was like it was always difficult when you know, when I would, like, okay, so say I'd have a week or a week and a half to take a vacation, you know, during the rut, I was like, oh, is that going to be, is that going to be enough time? And you talk to people from other areas, like, what do you mean? Like, that's not going to be enough time. I'm like, I need the whole season, really. Like, it's not, no matter how much scouting you do, all this different stuff if you're trying to hunt mature deer, like it's really, really difficult.
Yeah. And for me, I've told some other people this too, hunting this style, like I may put in 3 years on one buck, to get to the point where I feel like I could kill that deer, like I could realistically kill that buck. It's not the same as just trying to kill any deer, like, and that's, you run into the same issue here as everywhere else. You've hunted a buck. I've had 3 or 4 years worth of data. It's like one of the bucks I was after last year. A guy killed it Thanksgiving. I had the opportunity to hunt him the day before he killed him, and I didn't take that time that I knew where the buck was going to be. And sure enough, the buck got killed the next day. I go pull my card, and the buck was right where I should have been the day before. Like if I'd have just been there and pushed myself that extra day, I would have had that opportunity. I would have killed the buck that I'd been chasing for 3 or 4 days. But instead, some guy walking back to his truck, the deer crossed in front of him and stood in the road, and he shot and killed him. So like, those things just happen. But it does for me. It takes 2 or 3 years worth of data to really have a confidence that I can, hey, I think if everything works right and I have that day to hunt, I can kill this buck on this day. And it like I said, it takes years sometimes to kill a buck,
Yeah, no, it 100% does. And it's just, I guess I'm not at the point yet, but the more I talk to, I don't think there's very many people that hunt these types of areas that can just go in every year and figure out one buck and kill them. And that's why I'm always like, I might be hunting a specific deer, but I typically, I'll shoot other deer that would come into that area, but I always have backup spots, and I'm like learning of these other deer while I'm hunting another deer, because I know I can't just like hunt 3 years for one deer, he gets killed, and then try to go restart and learn another one. It's got to be like kind of coincided there, because it is so difficult, and they all have their own little tweaks and things that they like to do.
Yeah, you got to put yourself, I'm talking about hunting one deer, but you've got to have backups. I mean, if you don't, or you got to at least hunt in an area where you believe there's other bucks, because I mean it like kind of like you said, if you like I said earlier, if your buck gets killed and you're not the one that does it, and you've been chasing after it, man, it's really, you're scrambling then, to get back in the game a lot of times. So I try not to do that either. I try not to put all my eggs in one basket, or try to just say, well, this is the buck I got to have. And if I don't have it, I've had a bad season or anything like that. Because if you do that, man, you'll have a lot of bad seasons,
Yeah. Yeah, and our reason for telling you guys this that are listening isn't to discourage you, but it's to have, it's more so to help, because I've talked to so many people that'll be, it seems like all of a sudden November comes around and I'm getting a bunch of messages like, hey, I'm doing these things and it's not working out. And I'm like, hey, keep doing it, because it's just like, it's going to take time, and you got to just, you're doing the right things, but it doesn't always just because you're doing the right things work out, and it takes time to learn that and keep trying. I feel like, again, I say it all the time, but the people that are the most successful with it are a lot of times the ones that just don't give up, and they they have the knowledge, but they also go until the bell rings. Yeah,
you got to. You can't, you got to utilize if you have the ability to be out in the woods, you need to be there. Like you can't put excuses for not having success if you didn't put the time in to do it. You can't at the end of the day say, well, it didn't work out for me, and you left 15 hunting days you could have went hunting on the table. Like you hunting this type of way, you gotta utilize every moment that you can be in the woods. But at the same time, you've got to be very methodical and very strategic when you're hunting the big woods, as opposed to a lot of other areas. It's not the same. It's hunting big woods bucks and hunting low deer density deer is way more strategic in your preparation and your planning than hunting a lot of other type of deer that and I have a lot of experience doing it in different areas. And there's a lot more strategy. You've got to be a more strategic, methodical combination of a hunter to be able to be successful at it consistently, in my opinion.
And I'll say like the one mindset shift that has helped me personally, and maybe it won't for others, but like I look at every time I go into hunt as it's going to be the day that I kill them, so that I do all the details, I do all the things, and I don't look at it as if I have a week to hunt, because then sometimes I like kind of be a little bit lazy maybe at the beginning of it, or like, oh, I got this time. But if I look at it like this is the day I have to hunt, and I do that, and then I do that every day and kind of reset. It's like these shorter steps. When you look at, I know for me, like if I look at, say I have 2 weeks and I can go hunt, it's like, okay, I got 2 weeks. I got plenty of time. But if you look at it like, okay, every day just kind of doing the right things that I need to do, that seemed to help me kind of stay in that game a little bit better.
Yeah, that's a really good out. I think maybe I fall into the opposite. I try to, I probably need to take more of that approach, because I tend to take the approach of, or I've caught myself, and maybe it's just my my personality or something, but I'll take a week and say, okay, I got to kill this buck within this week, or I got to see the buck within this week, and probably doing what you're saying would be a more apt, thing to do is take each day to day, instead of looking at it as like a week long process. Put more emphasis on the day itself, and then break each day down. Instead of looking at it like I got to kill it within a larger time window, I got to kill it within a shorter time window. And I think you'd probably be a lot more detail oriented if you're doing that, if you have that mindset.
Yeah, and that's just like with my personality type. I felt like that's helped me do that. And it doesn't mean like that I'm just going to like jump into the best spot when the conditions are wrong or whatever. Yeah. It just means I'm going to look at the conditions and try to have the best plan for that specific day and conditions that they're being thrown at me. And I don't know, just that little mindset game, cuz like again, like we talked about, you got to do all you can to keep your mind right when you're hunting these deer.
Yeah, you really do. You got to keep that confidence up, because if you don't have that, and you're hunting, like I said, this low deer density, it can really play with your ego. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, Shane, I've kept you on long enough. I apologize for keeping you on here so long, but man, I just enjoyed talking about this stuff. And there was a giant list of other things that I wanted to cover, so we'll have to get you on again. But it was just fun to really break down the way you look at some of these hub systems and your real-time data that you have from this stuff, and being able to apply it. Like, I feel like we covered a lot of good stuff there. So thanks for coming on.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. It was great to talk with you. I really enjoyed it. Anytime you want me back, I'll be glad to share more data and information. So.
Great. And for anyone listening, you can check out Shane November Warrior Outdoors on YouTube as well as Instagram. Is there anywhere else that people can kind of find you at?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook as well. You can usually just look up Shane Parker, and you can connect to my page. I post a lot of stuff on my personal page, and then I have one dedicated to the outdoor page as well. So those three are my main ones.
Awesome. Again, thank you so much for coming on, Shane.
I appreciate it. Thank y'all.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of East Meets West Hunt with your host, Beau Martonik. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit eastmeetswesthunt.com, Facebook at East Meets West Outdoors, and Instagram at East Meets West Hunt. If you enjoyed today's episode, please review and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.